Welcome to Part 8 of the training on causal loop diagrams. This section will cover the last part of the workshop with the case study, the action ideas. For this video, you will need to access 3 resources from the supporting resources section of the training kit. You will need the causal loop diagram created from the case study, the action items document also from the case study, and you'll want to read through the leverage points information from Danila Meadows' website. Now that you've read the information on the Leverage Points website, you will know that leverage points are places in a system where an intervention creates the most change in the system. For the Action Ideas activity, participants were provided with a list of 9 potential leverage points adapted from Meadows' work. Changing the mindset or the paradigm of the system is considered the most powerful leverage point. Leverage points can also include interventions to change the goals of the system or the distribution of power in the system. Leverage points can also be the rules of the system and the structure of information flow. Feedback loops can be leverage points, and both the variables and the connections between the variables can also be leverage points. For this activity, the participants were divided into groups of 3 and asked to use a causal loop diagram to identify leverage points in the system that could be actions to address the question of how to increase social connectedness. Here's a picture of the document from the supporting resources section that shows the top 10 ideas developed by the participants. The groups were instructed to write the name of the action on the top of the piece of paper, describe the action, identify where it would impact the model, identify how easy or hard it is to implement, and explain, if successfully implemented, how much impact might this have on the problem. After the groups had brainstormed some ideas, we then shared the ideas around the room. In the next 10 slides, I will explain the 10 action ideas and how they were connected to the causal loop diagram. Referring to the action items document and the causal loop diagram, you can see that the first action item developed by the participants is a change to the mindset around allocation of resources. This action idea focuses on the 2 variables on the far right of the causal loop diagram, allocation of resources and community advocacy. The participants explained how it is important to change the mindset around funding, including not taking the deficit, meaning proper costing, and relaying work to funders or not lowering themselves. This was also related to community advocacy and making sure that they have a community representative where the decision making was happening. The second action idea also focused on a change in mindset, or a paradigm shift in the system. This change in mindset was around housing and homelessness. Specifically, looking at the causal loop diagram, the participants decided that in addition to what they were already doing with the Homelessness Task Force, they also needed to influence at a city level to increase physical spaces. They also suggested that they could create a resource hub for housing-related issues only. Another suggestion was to build community capacity by creating resources and also invite the MLAs to be more visible. This would enable impact to change the mindset of the politicians. The third action idea was to leverage current strengths, specifically thinking about what they were currently doing and how they could build on it. Although this particular action idea wasn't connected to a specific variable, it's related to the leverage point distribution of power in the system. The participants in this group thought that Translating grassroots mentality into funding opportunities was an important step in transferring power. The fourth action idea related to deepening connection to the community. This was a theme that ran throughout the Causal Loop diagram. Some of the ideas included making the community more walkable so that people felt more connected to their community. As well, it was suggested to engage community to recognize the similarities and differences and the shared experiences they have as a way of addressing and overcoming racism. Action idea 5 was to increase pride and identity in the community. This was related to the reinforcing feedback loop in the upper left corner of the causal loop diagram. Feedback loops are important leverage points in the system because they might be amplifying or dampening a desired or undesirable condition. It might be a place to intervene and try to stop the feedback or increase the feedback. In this causal loop diagram, the role of connection to the community is reinforced through a positive feedback loop with community identity, meaning as connection to the community increases, the community identity increases, and this is amplified in a feedback loop. The participants identified this as an important leverage point in the system, particularly since it was also connected to transiency and level of isolation, which ultimately fed back into social connectedness. One of the main ideas suggested for this action idea was that they needed to bring different neighborhood groups together and work in a united way instead of competing. Suggestions for doing this included educating groups about the gaps and highlighting the benefits of collaboration. They also talked about the need to develop common goals and information flow. This action idea is ideally suited to doing a social network analysis, the second tool that we'll cover in this training kit. So this action item is going to become the example for the case in the latter training videos on social network analysis. Action idea number 6 was related to creating advocacy committees with residents, nonprofit partners, and businesses. This action idea was a leverage point that connected the variables political support, political representation, and political power. The participants suggested that by creating these advocacy groups, they could have more political power, which in turn would affect allocation of resources. Action idea number 7 targeted a specific variable, but also a reinforcing feedback loop. The causal loop diagram suggested that personal wellness was an important variable as change flowed through it and directly affected a person's level of isolation. Level of isolation and personal wellness have a reinforcing relationship. So by targeting personal wellness through a free wellness program, the participants hope to reduce level of isolation. Action idea number 8 again targeted the reinforcing feedback loop of creating a connection to the community and a community identity. The variables in this feedback loop were seen as very important by the workshop participants. One of the ideas for creating a community identity was to introduce some neighborhood swag and banners to make the neighborhood identity more visible. Another idea suggested by this group was similar to one from the other idea, to have walking tours. Action idea number 9 was to create new community spaces. This action targeted the variable access to community spaces, with the idea to create neighborhood garden plots. It also targeted the relationship between access to community spaces and walkability, with the idea of with the idea of creating neighborhood garden plots to make the community more walkable. Lastly, action item number 10 was to develop awareness campaigns around racism. This action targeted the variable racism. Racism was an important connector variable that affected personal wellness, fear of rejection, which linked to level of isolation, and access to housing, which linked to transiency of the population as well as political support. This makes racism an important leverage point in the system. The participants suggested that maybe they could do an awareness campaign around racism. Unfortunately, due to time constraints on the workshop, we weren't able to spend as much time on this activity as we would have liked. The discussion was very rich, and the ideas being generated indicated a systems thinking lens had been adopted. However, as is evident with the 10 action ideas presented from the workshop, there was sufficient depth to the ideas to influence future strategic planning and decision-making. By using the Causal Loop diagram for the discussion and considering the leverage points, the strategic planning will have a more systems thinking lens and a more holistic approach that considers the interconnectedness of the problem. Ultimately, the goal was to create action items for strategic planning that used a shared map of the problem and that integrated diverse stakeholder perspectives and ideas. Feedback from the participants in the workshop suggested that these goals were achieved and the workshop activities had a positive influence on their planning to address this complex problem. Now you can take the Causal Loop diagram you developed in the last video and begin to identify leverage points in the system and action ideas. Use the same instructions that were given to the group and have fun brainstorming ideas through a systems thinking lens. In the next video, we'll give you a tutorial of how to use Vensim software.